I'm delighted to introduce our next keynote session with David Moskowitz, Executive Director and Content Architect of the DVMS Institute. In this presentation, David will unveil the blueprint for digital value management success, bringing together a wealth of insights and perspectives and addressing crucial facets of thriving in the digital era. The focus will be on what it takes to create and concurrently protect and then deliver digital value by leveraging change to people, culture, practices, and technology. David will then be joined by his colleagues from DVMS Institute, Rick Lemieux and Patrick van Schlag, to open a deeper conversation into the topic and to answer your questions in real time. So be sure to send those in via the Q&A chat during the presentation.
Hello, my name is David Moskowitz. I'm the Executive Director and Content Architect of the DVMS Institute. Rick and Patrick will join us after this presentation. What we're going to be talking about is building a roadmap for digital value management success, which, like it or not, requires culture. We'll also talk about systems thinking and a way of thinking differently. We'll introduce a model that we call the CPD model, which is an overlay over what the organization is already doing. It's not something new that you have to add to IDLE or COBIT or something else, but an overlay that already fits what the organization is doing. And finally, in this presentation, we'll talk about systems and culture and how the two fit together. Culture starts at the top. It starts with the leader who has to model and demonstrate the types of behaviors that they want to see, because that's the essence of what it takes to deal with setting culture. Note the quote from Satya Nadella. One of the things that he said in his book, Hit Refresh, was that when he was selected to be the CEO of Microsoft, he realized that his primary job was to be the curator of culture. He understood that he had to model and demonstrate 24 by 7 by 365 the culture that he expected to see throughout the organization. The way to do that, however, is not to just push, if you will, on a super tanker and think that you're going to get it to change direction quickly. You have to deal with small incremental changes, experiment and learn, innovate. And we talk about four aspects of innovation, and I'll get into those in a couple of slides, specifically incremental, sustaining, and adaptive and disruptive. We're not talking about a particular method like Scrum, but rather an approach that deals with incremental and iterative experimentation and learning. The goal is to break down silos within the organization so that people can collaborate and address culture as an aspect of innovation and improvement, because the behaviors are the way that you establish and understand culture. It's how employees feel, not how it's described. And to deal with that, we deal with something that we adopt from Johnson and Scholes called the culture web, which starts with this idea of a paradigm, which are the widely held assumptions, conscious or unconscious, knowing or unknowing, that the people within the organization and externally who work with it apply to the organization. Then we have the symbols, the visual representations of the organization, including brand logos, paint jobs, and everything else. Just to give you a quick example from real world, years ago when I worked for another company, all the employees were dealing with an orange and black, almost Halloweenish type environment on concrete floor, but the executive corner had plush carpets, nicely painted walls, art decoration. What message does that send? That's part of the symbolism that you have to consider. Power structures reflect both the formal and informal sources of influence that impact decisions, both strategic, cascading all the way through to operational decisions. They are not associated with the organizational structures. That's the next aspect of the culture web. These are the formal relationships that are related to the power structures that we just discussed. This is the stuff that you see on the org chart. Control systems describes what the organization chooses to monitor and measure in terms of understanding its performance and its controls and how resources are allocated and used. We get to rituals and routines. This is the way we do things here. It includes staff interactions, it includes what happens when somebody calls a call center, the scripts that they follow. It's the rituals and routines that are triggered by some type of or set of events. And finally, we get to stories. These are the things that the organization chooses to memorialize, but it's more than that. It's not just the stories that are told internally. What stories do ex employees tell about your organization? Because that is also an aspect of culture that the organization may have to address. So, with that as background, we get to this idea of what is a system. Systems, and we're not talking about operating systems that we might think of for a computer. We're talking about a whole. Systems have a purpose. They produce outcomes that don't necessarily require human intervention or human interaction. The solar system, climate is a system, transportation systems, air traffic control, organizations represent systems. Systems operate within an environment. The perception of the system depends upon the perspective of the individuals looking at the system. Are they in it and working within that system in an organization? Or are they external to it and observing it the way we observe the solar system and climate? So, structure and behavior are inexorably linked. We can't do anything about it. They are linked together. Change one, you impact the other. By way of an example, consider a golf ball that you drop, in this case, onto a concrete brick or a concrete slab. What happens? The golf ball bounces. Change the structure, and instead of dropping the golf ball onto a hard surface, you drop it into a bowl of mashed potatoes. Now what happens? The ball doesn't bounce. Change the structure, we've changed the behavior. But in order to think in systems, you have to look at it from a different paradigm. You have to look at conditions and constraints and understand that a system is not the sum of its parts individually working together, but rather it's the product of the interactions of those parts. We can visualize a system, and there is a visual language for a system. The reference is on the bottom of the slide, in this case from Gene Ballinger's Systems Thinking site. We have this thing called a balancing loop. The balancing loop starts with a current state. There is some gap between the current state and the desired state, so we take some action. The action causes the old current state to become the former state, creating a new current state with the understanding that there still could be a residual gap. In other words, we didn't close it altogether. So if we take a balancing loop and put two of them together and spin them in opposite directions, we have what in systems thinking is called an escalation archetype. And now what happens is the results of A impact B, the results of B impact A. And in fact, this archetype was created to explain the arms race during the Cold War. But let's take a look at a real world example of how that applies. If we take a non systems thinking, real world linear view and assume that the company view and the employee view are separate parts, then what happens? The company believes that they have disgruntled employees that are a threat to the company that need some type of response. The employee view of that same set of company actions is that the company's being unfair. They perceive that the company doesn't care about them, and that action serves to feed and convince more employees that the company isn't fair. Now, let's put these two together in the consequence or dealing with the consequence and an escalation archetype. And now we can visually see how the view of the employee and the view of the company feed each other, if you will, creating a Cold War that escalates. Without intervention, this is only going to get worse. So, aspects of innovation within a system. We have four types of innovation. Incremental are small, if you will, point changes. So, if you deal with a software product that goes from version 1.3 to 1.4, that's an incremental change. Typically, it might be things like bug fixes. A sustaining innovation is larger. Now we're going from that 1.3 to version 2. It's a major change that introduces new features and new capabilities. But we also have to look beyond what's happening at that level. What happens if we deal with a change to policy that we call an adaptive innovation, which has an impact on governance as well, because governance creates the policies that cascade throughout the organization. But there is also a disruptive innovation, and now we're talking about a change to strategy. The organization deals with a new market opportunity, potentially a merger and acquisition, but all these things change, potentially dealing with changing strategy. So now we deal with the thing I mentioned at the beginning, which is the DVMS CPD model. Don't let this fool you. It's only two escalation loops turned vertically with some stuff on the outside. And I'll explain and decompose this for you in a minute. I just want to focus on the thing that's on the right-hand side, that QOQM. That is our adaptation of the University of Maryland and Vicelli's creation that's based on GQM, goal question metric. He created another version that incorporated strategies called GQM plus strategies. And our version of that, to make it simple and fit into the CPD model, we call QOQM, question, outcome, question, metric. I want to call your attention to the QOQM on the right side of this before we delve into the rest of the model. CPD stands for Create, Protect, and Deliver Digital Business Value, which is part of what you need to understand for this roadmap to digital value management and digital value success. QOQM is our adaptation of Victor Basili's goal question metric combined with strategies that he called GQM plus strategies. The first set of questions in QOQM, question, outcome, question, metric, addresses the strategy and risk components to make sure that the outcomes that we're getting align with the strategic and operational intent. The second set of questions, question metric, look at making sure that we're actually delivering the right things so that we know that we're doing the right things the right way. The implementer and the auditor, those who create value and those who are responsible for determining that value is appropriately protected, are participants in both sets of questions and the development of metrics. And that's an important aspect because the model is create and protect, not create, then protect. Very quickly, to understand the difference, if your organizations have a QA department, that's typically after creation, that's create, then protect. What we need to deal with creating and enhancing the delivery of value in the 21st century is create and protect as concurrent activities. Now, let's take a look at decomposing this model. We start at the bottom and we look at the governance and execution loop. This is where we deal with incremental and sustaining innovation. The next area that we look at is the adaptive innovation. And now we also are paying attention to assurance and the feedback that we might have gotten from the strategic and execute our governance and execution loop. And we look at the governance issues that might deal with changing policy. Then we get to the disruptive innovation. And now we're looking at the potential changes to strategy. If we put this whole thing back together, you'll notice, and I'll run through it very quickly. Notice smack dab in the middle is adapt. It exists in the idea of innovation, disruptive, adaptive, sustaining, and incremental. And it's driven by QOQM because there's one other component. If you take a quick look at the strategy and governance loop, you'll see this thing that we call integrated strategy risk dealing with governance. Because it's that integrated strategy risk, combining strategy and risk into a single entity that serves as the source of being able to allow the participants in the QOQM activity to ensure that they're asking the right set of questions, both to get the right outcomes and to get the right metrics, all driven by strategy risk, which enables them to deal with, create, and appropriately protect because the risk component is surfaced as a part of what they're doing. But finally, we get to this idea of the 3D knowledge model. And I'll tie this together with the CPD model and innovation in a moment. I start with me, my team. I know what we did, I know what we're doing, and I know what we have to do. Now, this scales. This can be a single person or a very small company. We know what we did, we know what we're doing, and we know what comes next. If there's another team, part of what I have to consider, and even if it's a small team, I have, without other teams, I still have to consider the impact of what comes next on what we're doing now. And finally, I have to consider the impact that my team has on other teams. So if we look at this as a three-dimensional layer, the center is a moving piece because what we did, it becomes the former state. What we're doing is based on some action, and the other teams are moving with us concurrently. But then we add the next axis, the Z axis, and this is where we get strategic and operational intent. And what that does and ties this whole thing together, not only do I have to know what my team is doing and what other teams are doing and how I impact other teams, I also have to understand the constraints established by the strategic intent, and I have to understand the constraints established at the operational level in order for me or any of the other teams to be able to do what they're doing and develop whatever it is that we're trying to do, product or service. But I also have to look at improving and innovating both the capabilities that we have within the organization and dealing with assurance. So I improve the capabilities based upon feedback from the operational side, and I look at strategy and governance based upon what I'm getting out of assurance. And this is one of the reasons that we said that implementers and auditors have to work together so that both aspects, improving capabilities and improving strategy and assurance, all work together. But what happens in a larger organization? I've got other teams that are also dealing with this idea of sustaining and incremental innovation. They're also dealing with disruptive and adaptive innovation. And each one of those teams has to participate in improving the capabilities as well as the assurance that all of them are working together. But if you look at this and stack this up, now we can talk about the 3D knowledge and culture. If everything aligns as a perfect vertical, in other words, all of the teams and the culture of the individual teams are aligned, you have something vertical. But if, on the other hand, different teams are responding and behaving differently, then what occurs is that this tower, this stack, tilts like, if you will, the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And what that suggests is that you do not have cultural alignment within the organization. Now, we talked about early in this presentation about structure and behavior of a system being inextricably linked. You can't do one without impacting the other. So the x axis in this case represents behavior. It is the norms and values within the system. It reflects, if you will, the internal awareness and associated approach to collaboration. The y axis captures the organizational structure expressed as part of a formal approach to dealing with how teams and things interact, going back, if you will, to both the org structure and the power structure that we talked about with the culture web. And finally, we have leadership, which represents the vision, direction, and decision making that guides the system to strategic and operational intent and delivery. But take it one step further. All right. Why does it make sense to use this? Because if you do, part of what you're doing is breaking down silos, fostering collaboration, and strengthening the idea of teamwork. You're also identifying gaps and opportunities that enable you to both sustain the value that you're delivering to customers, as well as innovate and improve it and maintain a value proposition, because value is based on perception and it changes over time. Think about something for a moment. And some of you may not recognize it, but it used to be that things like air conditioning in a car was an option. But over time, what changed is that it's not an option anymore. It's standard equipment. Today, it's difficult to find a car that doesn't have power windows. They exist, but again, they're standard equipment. So that over time, the perception of what constitutes value changes. And the model as an overlay that we put together enables the organization to maintain a value proposition, because part of the feedback that's inherent in the CPD model is not just internal, but external feedback as well. So that gives us the ability to deal with not just internal gaps and opportunities, but also external gaps and opportunities. And finally, part of what we also get out of applying this as an overlay, which is essential to surviving in the 21st century, is the opportunity to deal with continuous learning and experimentation, which leads to and feeds the overall aspects of innovation. So, if we put these three ideas together, we talk about culture that impacts how we do things. We have an overlay that allows us to create and protect digital business value. And we layer that onto a behavioral model so that I can understand small company, large company, how it all fits together and how I deal with what I have to do to deal with delivering and improving and innovating the proposition to improve my competitive advantage in the 21st century. My LinkedIn information is on the slide. Feel free to connect. Coming up, we have the discussion with Rick and Patrick about answering any of your questions. So thank you very much for your participation and attention. Look forward to answering your questions.